Hello. So, in light of the recent video I made on Barack Obama's legacy, incidentally, anything I've got wrong in that video, I take full responsibility for. Um, in light of discussing leadership and legacy, there's three leaders I want to discuss, not greatly in depth, but there's something I noticed with all three. The three leaders are Lyndon Baines Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Tony Blair. Johnson, Nixon, of course, US presidents, Tony Blair, British Prime Minister. Um, Now, before I get into that, just a brief word on a video I've just seen, and I will make this brief because it's got no connection whatsoever, but it's worth mentioning. The Conservative MP, Anne Widdecombe, who's well known for being quite outspoken, made an interesting point on This Morning, which is a British kind of morning breakfast show. And she was discussing the Women's March of Piers Morgan and his colleague, whose name uh, escapes me just at this exact moment. Anyway, it was an interesting video because Anne Widdecombe was basically calling the Women's March ridiculous, and she raised a lot of important points about the fallacy that feminists put out about the so-called gender pay gap, pointing out that it's hugely taken out of proportion, and it was yeah, it was just an interesting segment. So if you want to check that out, just type in Anne Widdecombe This Morning; it should come up. As a woman MP, she makes a very interesting point about. She's retired now, as far as I know, but she makes a very good point about not being against tokenism. Basically, she made the point that Theresa May is prime minister. She shouldn't be seen as a woman prime minister. And basically, she rubbished some feminist arguments, and I find myself in full agreement with what she was saying. Um, and I wouldn't agree with all of her politics, but what she was saying made total sense. Unfortunately, that particular video, the comments are blocked, so there's no way to gauge what people thought, but it's got 89,000 views. Piers Morgan has been in a bit of hot water for, criticising the Women's March and all the rest of it. Anyway, I'll just leave that there for something to think about. Okay, so the three, try to keep this straight, the voice piece, just so that that should be okay. Okay, so the three leaders that I want to discuss: Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Tony Blair. Now, on the surface, only two of these individuals are connected, which is, of course, Johnson and Nixon, because they were contemporaries or near contemporaries. Well, yeah, they were contemporaries. Nixon, of course, had served as vice president under Eisenhower. Johnson as vice president under Kennedy. Both served as presidents. And they were really the two giants of American politics of the late 60s and early 70s. Tony Blair has no direct connection with either of them. But the reason I'm including Tony Blair in this sort of trilateral discussion of three leaders is that in all three cases, you have highly skilled political operators, highly complex men, highly intelligent men, and highly controversial men. All of those things are true for all three men. Now, of course, you could probably say that of most leaders. Most leaders are multifaceted, and it's difficult to say one leader is entirely bad or the same person is entirely good. Every leader, you'll get pros and cons. With Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Tony Blair, all three were involved in deeply controversial foreign wars. In the case of Johnson and Nixon, it was, of course, in Indochina, particularly Vietnam. In the case of Tony Blair, most notably Iraq, although Blair, during his premiership, was actually involved in 5 different conflicts. But Iraq, of course, will be on his epitaph. Um, Three very different personalities, three very different backgrounds. With Lyndon Johnson, you have a brash Texan. With Richard Nixon, a Californian, very skilled political operator. And with Tony Blair, he was, of course, British, so no direct connection. I want to just talk a little bit about the controversial aspects of each leader and maybe what it tells us about the nature of reputation in politics, because I think there's some very interesting things to take away from this. Why am I focusing on these three rather than others? Why not George Bush? I couldn't probably include Bush in this, but I think with George Bush, he's less of a complex figure than the other three. I think with George Bush, he wears his heart on his sleeve. What you see is what you get. With the other three, there's something Machiavellian about them, and something that really is multifaceted. Um, and like I say, you could possibly ascribe this to a lot of leaders, but these three I find particularly fascinating. Um, I've read many books on Tony Blair. I've read one very good book on Lyndon Johnson by Robert Dallek. I haven't read any biographies of Nixon yet, but I've certainly spent a lot of time, listening to interviews, manuscripts, all that sort of thing. Okay, so let's start with the first presidency, Lyndon Johnson. I came across an interview yesterday from 1990, and it was an interview with the writer, biographer, and historian Robert Caro from 1990. And he was discussing um, the sort of evolution of where he was writing about Johnson. Even though he's a New Yorker, he spent considerable time in Texas, exhaustive research. Johnson was a totally fascinating figure. When I was at university, I read a biography of JFK, but that was followed up. It was by Robert Dallek, by a biography on Johnson. And although the Kennedy biography was interesting, it was actually thicker, had far more pages. I found the Johnson biography even more interesting because with Lyndon Johnson, there's so many contradictions. Um, Firstly, he was born in real rough scrabble background. The hills region of Texas, as I understand it, was very poor. He was an exhaustive worker in terms of what he'd done, for example, to bring electricity to that region. Abundant political experience in both houses. Um, and it was, of course, a Johnson mannerism, which probably wouldn't go down too well today, to say the least. Um, I find that with Lyndon Johnson, like I said, there's contradictions. This is a president who passed the Civil Rights Act, arguably the biggest piece of race relations legislation since Abraham Lincoln freed slaves. And yet, there's many documents and many pieces of information that would indicate Johnson, told some pretty risky racist jokes, and not jokes so much, but there is one quote attributed to Lyndon Johnson, and I apologize for using this, but there's no other way to say it. Apparently, he said, "I'm going to get the niggers voting Democrat for 100 years." And I apologize to black viewers for using that word. I don't do it lightly. But it's to make the point that this is a man so hell bent on power that, on the surface, that comes across as incredibly scheming and Machiavellian and racist. I mean, there's no way about it. Using the M word is racist. Um, and yet, there's no questioning that Johnson clearly had passion and for compassion for the less fortunate. Vietnam. It's impossible to talk about Lyndon Johnson without looking at Vietnam and the utter catastrophe that was. I remember seeing a political cartoon showing Johnson asleep at night and basically haunted by the ghosts of Vietnam, sort of American GIs and Vietnamese villages and so on. Um, and it was, of course, a domino effect. And this isn't to give a history lesson, it's just that, that is something that is always going to be associated with him. And yet, his great society, the sort of programs that he put forward, Medicaid and Medicare and the Civil Rights Act. So the contradiction lies in the fact that you had one of the most progressive presidents in modern history, and yet behind that was a very quite an aggressive character, grandiose, sometimes very crude, very brash. You only have to listen to the audio description, so the stereotype about LBJ isn't made up. It's there. Um, he was just a complete phenomenon, um, and I find him fascinating. Certainly, a lot of the criticism is well deserved, but I think the reason Johnson ranks highly in presidential studies is his enormous capabilities. But with Johnson, and this is also true of Nixon and Blair, you get the impression that these were three men who could have been outstanding leaders, but they had those fatal flaws that really held them back. Now, moving on, one thing about Johnson, I mean, as a testament to his personal hardness, if I could put it that way, apparently he suffered from kidney stones during his congressional campaign, and he was in agony. As I understand it, that's one of the most painful things you can go through. And he was literally writhing in the back of the car that his campaign people were driving around, writhing in pain. And yet he still managed to campaign and win. That's, of course, where he got the epithet landslide Lyndon. But in that campaign, I think it was 1941, although I may be getting my campaigns mixed up here. But apparently he won by 87 votes, 87. And some say that he twisted that. There's allegations he betrayed Sam Rayburn, who had acted as a excuse me, father figure to him. Um, so, on one hand, Johnson fits right into the sleazy politician mold, scheming, Machiavellian. On the other hand, it's impossible to deny that Johnson had a real passion for the less fortunate. And this man was a complete phenomenon. When he retired, and his retirement was very brief, he died at the relatively young age of 65 in 1973, just 4 years after his term ended. Um, Apparently, he was haunted by regrets over Vietnam, and he's certainly not the first and won't be the last leader um, to have that situation. But I just find Johnson a fascinating figure. There's a lot of conspiracy theories that he was behind the Kennedy assassination. I'm quite skeptical. If for no other reason, it doesn't make a great deal of sense that he himself would have been in the firing line. So it would have been had to be really trusting of the shooter to be a good shot. Johnson was in the firing line, as I understand it. He was in the motorcade just behind Kennedy's car, and the Secret Service, of course, rushed him away when Kennedy was brought to the Parkland Memorial Hospital. Um, Having said that, power corrupts, and that level of power, yeah, definitely there's going to be some skeletons in the closet. Richard Nixon. Nixon, of course, won in '69 on the big promise of ending the Vietnam War. What happened was an intensification of the war. There was the Christmas bombings in 1972. Um, Thousands more servicemen died after Nixon took the oath of office. Um, to be fair, though, Nixon was inheriting a deeply divided country, um, which ironically is somewhat like Obama leaving office. I think there could be some comparisons between 1969 and 2017, not in terms of war, because Iraq and Afghanistan have greatly scaled down, but in terms of a divided nation. Um, with Richard Nixon, he was inheriting an incredibly tough situation. Again, Nixon, like Johnson, turned out to be a tragic political figure, and yet no one would deny Nixon's intelligence. Very bright guy, very, very astute mind. And that was clear even as an old man. And yet corrupt. He's a personification of corrupt. There was the intensification of Vietnam, of course. Watergate needs no introduction. He will always be tarnished as the only president to ever have to resign in disgrace. And yet there's a tragic side to that because Nixon had so much potential. This was a president that opened up to China to improve relations, which arguably then pushed Deng Xiaoping to open China up fully in 1978. I have no doubt that Nixon played a big role in that. He was a very skilled statesman. Um, and as I understand it, in terms of domestic legislation, he did sign progressive legislation on women's rights and the environment. Um, of course, with both Johnson and Nixon, I don't want people to get the wrong idea about my position. Both men will forever, forever have the blood of many US servicemen and Vietnamese civilians on their hands. And that will never, ever be, that cannot be whitewashed. Now, moving on to Tony Blair. Oh, one more thing about Nixon. His paranoia, of course, was very famous. I watched a clip from the film Nixon, the Oliver Stone film. Now, Oliver Stone and historiography don't quite go together. Stone is known for exaggerating and embellishing certain things, but there's one scene from that film, it's on YouTube, and it shows Nixon storming into a cabinet meeting and basically threatening to take off the head of colleagues. The closest recent equivalent we have in the UK is probably Gordon Brown. There was a period, I think it was about 2009, when Brown was accused of bullying cabinet colleagues, and at that time, my immediate thought was Richard Nixon, not so much in the bullying aspect, which was an allegation, I have to say, not necessarily proven, but in terms of the paranoia, you got the impression from Gordon Brown again. Probably I should have included Brown in this video. With both Brown and Nixon, you had very skilled politicians, very smart, but very paranoid, and very lonely figures in some ways. Um, so I can see some analogies there. Um, the thing about Richard Nixon, he usually ranks very lowly in presidential studies. I think he's currently 34th, which is pretty low. And yet he had all the criteria to be a great, great president. He had the experience, he had the intelligence, he clearly could win elections. He was a skilled statesman, and yet Watergate was his undoing. Arguably Vietnam was as well. Now moving on to Tony Blair. I have to say with Tony Blair, the temperament issue is somewhat different. Blair, put it this way, if he was paranoid and angry, he never showed it. Blair was a bit like Cameron and Obama in that sense. He had a very strong temperament. He never gave the impression that he was losing his temper. Of course, what went on behind closed doors is another example. In Britain today, Tony Blair is a deeply controversial figure, as controversial as Margaret Thatcher. And if truth be told, probably there is more people who are quick to denounce Blair and vilify Tony Blair than people who are willing to defend him. I wouldn't call myself a Tony Blair apologist. I certainly wouldn't go that far because there's many, many areas I can definitely see where criticism is legitimate. But I think, again, the tragedy with Tony Blair is you had, in my opinion, a great leader. I do believe he was a great prime minister. I don't believe he was an all-time great prime minister. I wouldn't put him in the top tier. But the tragedy of Tony Blair is you had a man who won three general elections, incredible skill, and did introduce a lot of very important legislation. The introduction of the minimum wage, the longest sustained period of growth in modern British history, um, improved equality legislation. There's a whole range of things that, and even if you know, the irony coming from left wingers is that Tony Blair's progressive legislation is incredible. Now, the critics of Tony Blair come from left and right. For the right, it's a Tony Blair criticism somewhat similar to that levelled against Obama. There was too much political correctness associated with his tenure. Um, and the thing about leaders is they're not necessarily personally responsible for these things, but they're very often tied in with what is going on in the social dynamic. So yeah, right wing criticism, there is that. There is also immigration, arguably increased in the Blair era. Right wingers really, really have strong views on that. Um, so that would be the main critique from the right. Also, the Conservative Party was always against the idea of nanny statism and targets and so on. That's always associated with New Labour. From the left, predominantly, he was a warmonger and far too close to George Bush. And yet, with Tony Blair, when I see interviews with the man, it is very, very difficult not to be somewhat compelled. Now, some people would say that's naive and he's a liar. I I happen to believe that Tony Blair is actually a very skilled leader. I mean, put it this way: if he was as awful as people make him out to be, why would he have won a third general election after the invasion of Iraq, after 2005? So, like Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, you have a very skilled statesman, very clever political tactician who is a vilified figure. and who is forever going to be haunted by, in his case, his role in Iraq. So I'll round this up. Obviously, this can be applied to other leaders, pretty much most other leaders, but those three in particular, and perhaps we can extend that to Gordon Brown. Although with Gordon Brown there was less of the war aspect. Brown continued Blair's wars, but there was less of that connection. Um, with those three people, I find them utterly fascinating. I think there's things they done that were unforgivable in all three cases, and yet for me they remain enduringly fascinating leaders. I could listen to interviews of them all day. I really could. I mean, when Tony Blair, Blair has an answer for everything. Some would say that just makes him a scheming bastard, but I think he is one of the cleverest leaders in modern British history, indeed in modern world history. Um, so I do think history will judge Tony Blair in a somewhat different way, but it remains to be seen. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. Obviously, I'm 31, so I don't have that direct experience of living under either Johnson or Nixon, but I did live under Tony Blair. It was Tony Blair that politicized me in a way that probably no other politician has. So I'm fascinated by Blair and Blairism. Doesn't mean I consider myself a Blairite because I don't. My brand of centrism is not exactly akin to Tony Blair's brand of centrism, and I will touch on that in another video. So stay tuned and let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.